Oh, good morning, everyone. How are you? Good. Nice to see you. Nice to see you all at this wonderful festival. This is actually the third time I've spoken at the Schweiner Festival in Craddock, and thank you for Lisa and Sandra for inviting me back again, which is always a pleasure to come here. I'm just going to introduce myself first of all. My name's Dean Allen. I'm probably best known in South Africa for writing the book Empire, War and Cricket, which is about the story of Mikey'sfontein. So, but it's more than Mikey'sfontein. I don't want to be known as Mr. Mikey'sfontein for the rest of my life, but the book's done particularly well. When it was released in 2015, we had kind of modest expectations for it, but Jenny Chris-Williams, you've probably heard of her, the book lady, she said to me, Dean, if you sell 2,000 copies of a book with the word cricket in the title, you've done well. Well, it's sold over 10,000 copies now in South Africa. Because it's a book, it's about more than just cricket, of course. It's about history, it's about a time in our period of our history that I'm going to be talking about now, today. The colonial period, which is, of course, controversial. In fact, when the book was released, they were just removing the statue of Cecil Rhodes in front of the UCT. So instead of us answering questions about Mikey'sfontein and cricket in the media, I was talking about, or trying to navigate the difficult subject of colonialism, Cecil Rhodes, their legacy, and those kind of things. So it taught me very quickly to be very diplomatic as well. If you've read the book or you understand about any of the history that I write about, I'm not particularly sympathetic to that period, but I think that we need to discuss it. History has happened, or what has happened in the past, and I think certainly in South Africa we need to learn from the past if we're going to navigate the future as well. You're probably wondering, first of all, how someone with an accent like this came to South Africa. I'll just give you the brief background. It was a lady that brought me here originally. Her name was Van der Merwe. I met her in England. I was going nowhere in my mid-20s. I was working in an office. I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. She was a dentist. I'm from the West Country of England. And she said, why don't you go back to university? So I did. I gave up my safe office job, and at the age of 26, I went to university. First person in my whole family to do so. I was going to be a PE teacher. You see, I love sports, like kids. I thought that was the natural thing. A few months at university, I thought, hang on a minute, you guys out the front have got a decent job, university lecturers. So I decided to buckle down, and that was what I thought I was going to do. I was going to navigate the academic route. So I came to South Africa, did a master's degree at Stellenbosch University, and ended up doing a PhD. And have taught at universities all around the world. But my relationship, unlike with Miss Van der Merwe with South Africa, has continued, because this is where I want to be. This is why I love this country. And I understand that its complex past needed to be navigated carefully. So I found myself, as I said, at Stellenbosch University in the mid-90s or late 90s, and it was quite unusual for an Englishman to be in Stellenbosch in those days. In fact, there seemed to be only two of us, myself and a guy called Richard who studied geology, and our Afrikaans friends would say to me, Dean, have you met the other Englishman in town? And eventually we got together reluctantly and became good friends. But the point was being, I found that I could make a contribution at the time because people had written about other places in terms of sport, colonialism, places like the West Indies, India, Australia, but it had yet to be uncovered really here in South Africa. And that's what took me to this little place called Mikey'sfontein, because whether you like sport or not, it has a cricket connection. You may have heard that it was the first place an international cricket match was played. Well, I'm sorry to say that isn't strictly true. The first match was played down in Port Elizabeth at St George's Park. But Mikey'sfontein was one of those quirky little towns that had a big story that went well beyond sport. I met David Warden at the time, who owned Mikey'sfontein. He became a very good friend of mine, and he inspired me to write the book. He said, never mind this PhD you're writing, you need to turn this into a book. It's one hell of a story. So unfortunately Dave passed away in 2010. And he didn't get to see the actual book that was released some years later, but he did read my PhD, and he said to me one day, Dean, this is one heck of a story. You need to turn this into a book for the South African public. So that's why the book has done so well, because don't worry, if you're not interested in cricket, there is a chapter that's quite cricket heavy. It's about other things. I've run the time, this particular period, the late Victorian period, the 1880s and 1890s, through the life of an individual, through the life of a man called James Logan, who created Mikey'sfontein, but also through the place. So it's tangible. People can go to Mikey'sfontein, as they can come to Craddock, which I'm going to explain in a minute, and actually feel the history. And I think that's so important. When you're teaching students, certainly 18, 19-year-olds at university, It's important that they feel what you're talking about, they understand. And as I often say to them, history doesn't have to be boring. You know, hundreds of years ago, history is what happened on Saturday night, if they can remember that. You know, it's what happened yesterday, it's what happened an hour ago. So it's what's happened in the past. So coming here to Craddock, I should just give you the background to this. This is my partner Danny here. Danny's from Slovakia. She's also fallen in love with South Africa. And we found ourselves in this crazy time, 2020, and I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll put it in context of what's happening at the moment with COVID-19. But we found ourselves in Cape Town back in March. And then we heard, of course, that there's something was going to change this year. Nobody expected us to, how it's changed our life. But what happened, we found ourselves in Cape Town. And because we're both country people, our natural instinct was, let's get out into the country. So actually, during lockdown, we found ourselves in wilderness. Beautiful part of the country. We found ourselves right on top of the hill there, where the map of Africa, if you know that is, on a small holding. And we had the space to actually at least walk around and get outside. And it was the best thing. Danny found that little Airbnb. It was the best thing we ever did. And during that time, it gave me a chance to think about where I was going in terms of my career. We did some incredible things. I ended up interviewing the Springbok rugby players over an 8-week period. I spoke to Schalkberger, Brian Habana, even Francois Pienaar and the guys of 95. So there was opportunities even during lockdown. So it's been quite an incredible year. But we were itching to get on the road again. So when Lisa and Sandra invited us to come back to Craddock and say, listen, won't you do what you do with Mikey's Fontaine here in Craddock? Piece together these stories. Try to give it a historical perspective. We were delighted to get in our car and come here. So for the last 6 weeks or so, we've been in and around Craddock, gathering information, meeting people. What a wonderful job, hey? So we had to stay for the Schweiner Festival, so this is the culmination of that. Now, when Lisa said to me, an historian's perspective, first thing I've got to say to you is history is troublesome. It's obviously written from a certain perspective. That book is written from a certain perspective. I give that to my students. I say, is that book any good? And of course, they want to get an A, so they say yes. I said, well, there's problems with that. It comes from my viewpoint. Even though it's from a PhD and I've gathered the information, of course, it comes from a certain perspective. And often you've heard the saying, history is written from the view of the victors. Now, we were at a presentation by David Hilton Barber yesterday talking about the 1820 settlers. Now, we all have a perspective of that history in our period of South Africa. But perhaps there's different perspectives as well. So I just want you to keep that in mind. But I do believe, somebody says, if we don't learn from history, we're doomed to repeat it. That's something that's important. So I was glad to hear we're just discussing about the name change in Grahamstown. There was some debate. I know when the statue was removed at UCT, it was almost overnight that thing went down. I think it's important that we talk about history. We recognise there's different viewpoints. Different cultures have different ways of recording their history as well. So it is troublesome. I've got about 20 minutes to just pick out some key events and what I've found on our journey in the last few weeks or so. Now, where do I start? The thing is with South Africa, it's a case of who was here first, I often think. That's where this problem comes. I mean, I'm talking about colonial history, when the British arrived, the British Empire, that kind of era. But we've got to go back to the indigenous people, the Khoisan, the hunter-gatherers that roamed this area originally. Then we know in the African tribes that came down from sub-Saharan Africa, they came down into this part of the world, and this area especially was contested, especially with the arrival of the Europeans. And we all know the history that we were taught at school, a lot of us, Jan van Riebeeck, 1652, the Dutch East India Company that wanted to control the Cape because of what it offered there. But for me, it was the arrival of the British, really, with permanent control in 1802 that changed everything. Because the British were empire builders. They were, at that stage, they were contesting the world with other European powers, namely France, and they recognised that the Cape was a strategic point. Up to that point, it was a refreshment station. The Dutch East India Company were traders. It was a company, it was a private enterprise. But here we had the British, and they were slightly different, because wherever we've seen that, wherever they've gone, they've created an empire. They replicate things, names, culture, language, customs, those kind of things, wherever they've been around the world. And that's really how Craddock came about, because we know that Sir John Craddock, I'm sure you know, in 1814 he was the Cape Governor, this bombastic military man, wanted this area settled for the British. He wanted to create almost a buffer. With the cause of people that were coming down, he saw the Fishery River as a natural barrier. So in 1814, when the British were trying to expand their influence throughout southern Africa, this became, as we know, the frontier land. Really a frontier between different people. And added to that, we had the Trek border, of course, the Afrikaner now, who was linked to this land, who are now farming this land. So we had this kind of tension between empire builders, farmers, and tribespeople in this area. Now, I don't usually need notes, okay, but I've got various dates here, and I don't want to forget to include stuff. Normally I present to lovely pictures, so excuse me even holding that, but I'm just referring to it as a crib sheet here. So we've got now this settlement, or a fort as it were, because we've got various settlements here in 1814. And the perspective, when I've travelled around and spoken to people, I've tried to piece this thing together in terms of a timeline. Now, one of the most important things, of course, around that time was religion. So the first minister, John Evans, you see his name around town, you see plaques up in the churches. He became the first minister of Craddock in 1817. And then the 1820s. David Hilton Barber yesterday was talking about the 1820 settlers. Wherever we've travelled in this region, the 1820 settlers come up time and time again. But let's just put that into context of why these predominantly English families were encouraged, should we say, to come here and again populate this region. Well, back in the United Kingdom, this was not some Downton Abbey effect. This was a tough time to live. Thousands of people wanted to get on ships, risk their future because of the hardship back in the old country. Perhaps it's the reason why I left Britain in the 1990s and why I don't want to go back. I prefer South Africa, to be quite honest, the weather, etc. But I knew what I was coming to, they didn't. So the Napoleonic Wars, you had the Industrial Revolution, changing the whole landscape of Britain at the time. So you had these families, often working class families, who basically chanced everything to get on a ship and come to southern Africa. Now, we've met descendants of the 1820 settlers. It's almost like royalty in this. I'm an 1820 settler. I mean, it's this kind of thing. But if we go back, these were actually quite often desperate families, as I said, who got on a ship and risked everything. And if you read the accounts of those families, quite incredible. We took a trip now just down the coast. Of course, we've gone through Grahamstown, founded in 1812 by Colonel John Graham as a garrison town. Again, one of these fort outposts to build up and stake almost the Brits planting a flag in the ground. Grahamstown was the largest, at the time, the largest town after Cape Town. So this was significant around this area. We've also visited places like Bathurst. You all know Bathurst, of course, with that rich settler history. Also got the oldest pub in South Africa, the Pig and Whistle. So the Brits created religion, but they also obviously liked pub life as well back then as well. So in 1821, the oldest pub supposedly was formed in Bathurst. But we picked up on a particular group, the Nottingham Party. The De Motts, the Seftons, they spent 130 days at sea. Before that, they had to travel overland from Nottingham by their own means to Liverpool. They then spent 130 days, over 4.5 months, on a ship. They landed at Cape Town, and this is what amazed me. A lot of them, of course, perished or certainly suffered on that ship. They weren't even allowed off the ship at Cape Town for a break. They had to sit on that ship. They then made their way, of course, to the Eastern Cape, where they were carried ashore, as we found out yesterday. I mean, incredible. And they were then in a refugee camp as such, in tents on the coast, where they had to wait weeks before they were then taken into the interior and dumped, literally. So I'm sure, would they have signed up for this if they'd have known? It wasn't the kind of dream they were given. I mean, incredible. I read the accounts of one mother, and she said, "Tonight we're going to perish. The wolves and tigers are going to eat my children." They literally didn't know what they were going to face. So they were incredible people. A lot of them, of course, left the land and went straight to Grahamstown, where they had their trades already matched. They weren't farmers. A lot of them were actually labourers. You know, perhaps they had more, blacksmiths or whatever. So they needed an urban area in which to practice their trade. So they were ill prepared. And I found it quite interesting that one of the accounts, the leaders, as you know, each party had a leader. He actually reported, he said, "Unfortunately, my party seems to have more eaters on board than workers." So they didn't pick these ladies and gentlemen due to character. It was like a lottery. They were on the ship and they were there to populate. So thank Britain for sending you, and you are literally in a buffer zone now. As I said, this was a contested area. Not only the wild animals, of course, but pretty inhospitable locals were there to meet you as well. So that kind of frontier land, you still kind of feel it here. But what was happening back here in Craddock? Well, this was now one of those popular, can we say, towns that was growing. You can imagine even the settlers were trying to get to towns through protection. By 1848, the English painter Thomas Baines reported a beautiful small town of 9,000 people. He reported half being white, half being coloured, in his own words. Also in 1848, and I'm glad Sandra is here, the Victoria Manor was built. So this was now a bustling town, and a wonderful old hotel, which has inspired me, of course, to write Mikey's Fontaine story, the Lord Milner. Well, in 1848, some 50 years before that was being built, Victoria Manor was being built here in Craddock, because this was a bustling town. People were now moving through this region. Market Street, where we've got the privilege of staying, incredible history. You can walk down that street today and feel how it was, because through the wonderful efforts of the Antrobus family, that street is being preserved. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what inspired me to come to Craddock, because it is unique. There's very few places like that. And I will say this, it is more unique than Mikey's Fontaine. Mikey's Fontaine is a folly. It is a health spa that was created by an ambitious young Scotsman, almost a show. This is a real town with real people, and you can still see that. So the Victoria Manor Hotel, which of course has changed quite a lot, and Market Street are remnants of that. So if you haven't, I'm sure you all know it, walk down Market Street and read the history behind even those houses. You have Lyon's House, for example, which pays homage to the Danes that were here. Togger van Abel Flemmer, sorry for the pronunciation. A family that, would you believe, collected wild animals, lions, and sent them back to Europe. You have, obviously, you pay homage to, we're at a Writers' Festival, Guy Butler, no less, has obviously born in Craddock, and Etienne van Heerden. I have the pleasure of knowing Etienne, and we have a house that pays homage to Etienne there as well. There's certain buildings in this town that stand out. Over the past few weeks, I'm pretty active on social media, I'm sure you've seen that, but what I want to do in terms of history is to make it accessible. So I collect little stories and put them together, and that's how it works. You know, never mind writing a PhD, that's how you reach people. In 1868, that incredible church was completed at the cost of £34,000, which was quite a thing in those days. The Moederkerk, of course, which is, as you probably know, an exact replica of St Martin's in the Field in Trafalgar Square. And as Julie and Chris has written, because they are the absolute king and queen of writing these wonderful, quirky stories. Supposedly there was a love story. The Dominie had an English wife who was feeling homesick, so he decided to choose that as a design. Whether that's true, as I said, let's not let truth get in the way of a very good story here. But isn't that wonderful? But we do know we've left with one of the most impressive, certainly, churches in the Platteland. When I put that story up, 65,000 people reacted, or it reached 6. People were talking about how they were christened there, how their mum and dad or their grandparents. And it's that personal connection that I found here in Craddock. More than anywhere that I've gone, people have that connection with the town. But what about famous people? Now we can name drop. We're here at the Schweiner Writers' Festival. And you know Olive Schweiner, the South African novelist, was here between 1867 and 1870. In her teenage years, supposedly quite an awkward young teenager, walking up and down Breer Street, mumbling to herself. Little did we know that later she was probably going to be one of the earliest feminists. She was going to write about equality in the world. Back then, she'd have been laughed at. Now, where would she have been today with Black Lives Matter and those kind of things? Right at the forefront. She'd have been a thought leader, of course. There's a connection with Olive Schweiner, you probably know. She lived at Mikey's Fontaine as well for 2 years. She moved there in 1890. She wrote about the wonderful isolation and the inspiration she got from the Karoo. The story of an African farm, of course, is written in that region as well. But now, I mean, this is hard for me to put this into context, but 1867, a diamond was found near Kimberley. It was going to change southern Africa. So Craddock was right in the centre of the traffic that was going up and down from the coast to the diamond fields. railways, empire. Remember what Cecil Rhodes said later? He was going to build a railway from Cape Town to Cairo to paint Africa red for the British. So the railways arrived in Craddock, and it meant that the blacksmiths and the farriers of Market Street were now going to suffer in terms of their livelihood. And the irony is that lorry trumbles by. I will come to modern history of Craddock as well, and where we are today in Craddock. The other thing I always pick up when I come to towns is that, because I'm a teacher, is the state of the schools. And I think schools are so important in a community. And we visited and I've given talks at Craddock High School and at Marlow. And these two schools are still thriving, and that's good to know. We've got very good teachers in this town. Craddock High, as I've been told, Craddock Boys' School was founded in 1870. Rocklands Girls' School was in 1875. Now that is quite early for a girls' school, if you look at the history of Britain, to have a girls' school. So in other words, you probably had more opportunity as a woman here in Southern Africa than you certainly did back in the old country, where girls' schools were still, quite a rarity. This was a man's world. This was a patriarchal society that was creating the empire, of course. And as I was told by a good friend of mine, and that's the other thing, I've met so many wonderful people over the past few weeks. Charles Garth, he has the claim to fame, a proud Craddock man, of being in the class of 1972, and this is when Rocklands and Craddock Boys High amalgamated to become Craddock High. And he said, in his own words, that's where my grades went downhill, because for the first time we had girls in the class. So he's quite proud of the fact that he struggled at school for that reason. Now, going back to my timeline, talking about the school, I just want to make some comparison with Mikey'sfontein. James Logan, the 19-year-old who arrived, a working class, another guy coming down here to find his fortune, who created Mikey'sfontein, he only arrived in 1877. So this is how much later this history was. He got in with the right people. He got in with Cecil Rhodes. He got in with the politicians. And if you've ever heard me talk about this is quite a story. It's like a Downton Abbey story. But it was happening later. Now, he was an opportunist, a charlatan, some may say. He got in with the right people. He was a railwayman. As the railway was being built into the interior, trying to reach from Cape Town to Kimberley. But Craddock was already thriving. But what was going to scupper and change the direction of everyone here was the Anglo-Ball War of 1899. Now, this is awful history. I'm jumping ahead here, but I just want to pick out key events. Now, according to Jan Smuts in the introduction to Dennis Reid's Commando, the Anglo-Boer War was other than most wars. It was an epic struggle between the smallest and greatest of people. And what fascinated me when I arrived, remember I was with a Valva when I first arrived to study at Stellenbosch. Her grandparents were reluctant to meet me. And I realised that there was a divide that even I didn't understand. We all know about perhaps the division between black and white within South Africa, but what within the white community? And that goes back to the Anglo-Boer War. So that's what made me focus upon this time period. And Mikey'sfontein was a perfect vehicle in which to look at that time period. And here in Craddock, of course, we were thrust right in the middle of what was a civil war. It wasn't just English against Boer, it split families. And the stories I've heard around this area are quite incredible. And we could talk all day. I mean, here in Craddock, you can see at the Craddock Club, which was founded in 1881, the Derbyshire Regiment or the Sherwood Foresters would base themselves here, but they didn't have an easy time of things. Commandant Kritzinger was causing havoc in the area. There's a famous battle against Captain Spandau. Both men are buried ultimately in Craddock Graveyard today. There, if you go to the top of Okop, the little mountain that overlooks the town, you can see the Boer War etchings of those British troops that were stationed here. You can tangibly feel this period. Like at Mikey'sfontein, when you can walk around the veldt and pick up the bully beef cans. You can still feel that time. So that inspired me as well to write about Mikey'sfontein, and there's something about the atmosphere here around that time. In 1910 we had the Union of South Africa, and that shaped the politics of the 20th century. But just round the corner, the Great War, 1914. And in Market Street, we have a winner of a VC at Delville Wood, William Folds, who lived in one of those houses. We had the privilege of staying in that house. What more do you need for history? So you have this tangible thing. But that brings me back today, because at the end of that awful war, the Great War, the world was going to face a challenge it had never faced before, the greatest natural disaster the world had ever seen, the Spanish flu. And as I explained to the guys at Marlow during my talk, this is not the first time we've sat in audiences wearing masks. 100 years ago, nearly at one, well, the conservative, the recognised estimate is 60 million people, but they say now over 100 million people globally lost their lives as a result of the Spanish flu. Can you imagine that after coming out of the First World War? Quite horrific. Here in South Africa, we were the 5th worst hit country in the world. 300,000 people lost their lives in 6 weeks. And how was it brought here? Through travel. Through troops returning, again, for fighting for the British during the First World War. So boys were getting off ships at Port Elizabeth, travelling back by train to Craddock, and then spreading death amongst the community, inadvertently. Quite a tragic time. Did you know that more people lost their lives in the first 25 weeks of the Spanish flu than in 25 years of HIV/AIDS? So, without trying to alarm you, I think history can teach us so much about today. It puts things into perspective. We have been through this before. We will get through this. Geez, they were tough back then. Great War, then a Spanish flu. And by the way, we've got a fascination, it sounds morbid, but we've got a fascination with graveyards. When we go to a new place, we tend to look round. You can see the history of the place. If you go into the graveyard here, you'll see the grave of 2 Botha brothers. The Botha brothers were sheep shearers. In 1918, these young men were shearing sheep one day. One of them fell ill, was taken into the house. By the time his brother fell ill, later that day, the first one had died. Both boys died the same day. And it says they died from Spansa Griep, the Spanish flu. So we can see that here in our own town. Now, you can see Craddock, incredible history. It's kind of piecing it together. But we have some amazing things here. In 1937, the Mountain Zebra Park was created. There, as you know, we have Karoo, rhino, black rhino. We don't tell too many people about that, of course, but over 1,000 mountain zebra that have been preserved as part of this park. We had the privilege of driving around there. For me, it's one of the picturesque, in fact, the most picturesque national park in the country. So whether you see game or not, you see this wonderful felt, which is quite spectacular. The Second World War came along, of course. Craddock was affected. Boys from this town, men and women from this town were affected as the rest of the world. But of course, there was that contentious issue around the 1940s. And then 1948, the National Party came into power and apartheid. Now, that is not a subject or an area that I want to talk about today. But there is something about that time, 1985, the Craddock Four. And that's something that I've also talked about in recent sort of stories, and of all the posts I've made, that is the most contentious, because that is still, obviously, and it will continue to be a raw thing. But we know Matthew gone away, and his 3 colleagues lost their lives in June 1985 for something they believed in. Struggle, protest, and I recorded it. That's exactly what happened. But today, now let's bring it forward to today to wrap up. Only weeks ago, we walked through the town and there were protests still here in Craddock against government corruption, perhaps. And certainly earlier in the day, it was a very well organised, peaceful protest. Men and women, children were out. And that shows me something. Regardless of the trouble that came later in the day, which is unfortunate, there's a pride about this town. People have responsibility, and perhaps that goes back to the days of the Craddock Four. It's a proud town, Craddock. It's probably got the worst roads I've ever experienced in the world. And as I mentioned before, these lorries, I feel that there's a lot of problems in Craddock, but there's a lot of problems elsewhere in South Africa. We've had the privilege of driving through the Platteland. You can see how towns have perhaps deteriorated in recent years. We went to places like Wepener, Hobhouse. You can see how those communities have just disappeared. But here, as long as there's people like Sandra Antrobus, Charles Garth, Chris Murray, and Julie, this town will continue to flourish. Because, as I said, as I often say when I defend South Africa, there's problems everywhere. We've certainly got problems back in Britain. Look at that Prime Minister and look at Brexit and all that that's going on. So we need to put things into perspective. For me, it comes down to it's a bit of a throwaway line, but the 3 S's I've identified. Schools, tick. Sport, and that comes with events, the Fish River, the kind of community. And the main important thing is society. Society here in Craddock is still the fact that we've managed to get together a group of people in these times. And I spoke to Lisa this morning and I said the most important thing is we keep this going, because next year, hopefully, and the year after, it will be back to normal. So thank you for turning up and supporting us. And I also looked at what I call the big 5 of Craddock, the things we should look at in terms of the positives. The first of all, as I've mentioned, is the historical places. There's some real places of significance here, a bit like Mikey's Fontaine, that will tell us a story of South African history. The stories and events that have happened that Craddock were at the centre of, that we can use. And by the way, when you write history, if anybody who's ever tried to study it, it's so important to find characters and places that people can relate to. So it's all very well me talking about imperialism and colonials, but if you can point to buildings and events, that's the most important thing. Don't forget the role of famous people. We have Guy Butler, Etienne van Heerden, Olive Schweiner, William Folds. We have people that have come from this town. Matthew Gonaway have come from this town and changed the world in their own way. The Mountain Zebra Park is unique. It's something that should be celebrated. And the final thing of the Big 5 is the town and its people. I don't think I've ever met more friendly people. Like I say, we've been in town for 6 or 7 weeks and we've been embraced. I've learned to sort of, as an Englishman should do in South Africa, keep his mouth shut, absorb things, accept invitations when they come, because we've had some incredible invitations to farms and whatever. I've experienced some incredible stuff. And I think I'm going to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time and enjoy the festival. Thank you.